Understanding the difference between active and passive voice is one of the most important skills you'll learn in media writing. That's because knowing the difference can determine whether your writing is clear and understandable or whether it's a little bit muddy. And so what's really going to be important in our determination is where our verb is in the sentence and where the doer is in relation to the verb. So let's look at active voice. In active voice, the subject conducts the action. And if you use the subject-verb direct object construction, you will always write in active voice. So let's look at some examples. The dog bit the boy. So where is your verb? Your verb is bit, and your doer, the dog, comes before the verb, and your direct object is the boy. So in an active voice sentence, the doer will always come before the verb. The tornado destroyed many homes. So if you look here, destroyed is your verb, tornado is your doer, your subject, and homes is your direct object. So subject, verb, direct object. Now passive voice is, we're going to use the same information, but we're going to write it in passive voice, and you'll see how it's going to be a little bit different. The boy was bitten by the dog. Now we have the same information. Our verb is a little bit different because we had to add a helper verb to write this way, was bitten. But look where your doer is. Your doer is at the very end of the sentence. And we also had to add a few words to be able to do that. By the dog. So passive voice sentences traditionally have to add a helper verb and also by the, and you fill in the blank there with the doer at the end. And our recipient now is at the beginning of the sentence. Here's the same sentence we had before, but now we're going to write it in passive voice. Many homes were destroyed by the tornado, so we still have the same information, but our doer comes at the very end. And our recipient, the homes, comes at the beginning. The difference here is that in passive voice, I really need to wait till the very end of the sentence to find out everything that happened. In active voice, when I get to the end of the sentence, I'm ready to go to the next sentence. But here in passive voice, when I get to the end of the sentence, I need a little bit of time to process what I just read and put it all together. So that's why it slows the audience down just a little bit. It's a little bit harder to understand. Now here's another passive voice sentence. The bicycle was lost. So we have was lost as our verb, but we don't have a doer in this sentence. And that might be because the writer chose to leave the doer off, or maybe the writer didn't know who the doer was. In either way, it's still going to be passive voice. And in passive voice, the main character, the doer, comes after the verb. Now, here are a few things that sometimes people get confused about, right? So, active voice is not the following: that it always has to be in present tense, and that's not true. Active voice can be in past tense, it can be in present tense, and it can be in future tense. Or if I have a helper verb, then it must be in active voice, and that's not true either. You can have a helper verb and you can be in active voice, or you can have a helper verb and you can be in passive voice. Sometimes people think to be an active voice that I have to be doing some really extreme action, right? I have to have movement. But it's really not true. You can be quiet and still be an active voice. You can still have a verb that indicates that you're quiet and that you're still. So why do we want to use active voice? It really sounds better. Is it always wrong to use passive voice? Absolutely not. Sometimes we might choose to highlight the recipient of the action. Here's an example. Usually you see this in an accident or a death or something where the recipient of the action is actually the subject of our story. This is a person or a thing that we want to hear about. That person or thing didn't do anything. Something was done to the person. And so we put that subject first. So look here, we have a bus driver was hurt Friday when his bus stalled on the tracks in front of an empty Amtrak passenger train. So the bus driver didn't do anything. He was hurt because the train hit his bus. And so, but we want to focus on the bus driver. So you might see that too. Maybe you have a sentence like this where the story is about results. Now, the results didn't do anything. Somebody published the results, but the results are what the story is about. And so that's why we talk about it first. Let's look at some examples of active versus passive voice. How would we write the same sentence if we wrote in active or we wrote in passive? So the journalist was kidnapped. So that's passive voice. The journalist didn't kidnap himself, right? We just don't have the doer attached to the sentence yet. But what if we put the doer first? Look how much more interesting this is. And not only that, but we know who's responsible. The terrorist group ISIS kidnapped a journalist. Now look at this. A sports story written in passive voice would not be a popular story to read at all. The touchdown pass was thrown to win the game. That really sounds pretty sad to me, honestly. But what if we do this? Saints quarterback Drew Brees threw the touchdown pass to win the game. See how much more exciting that is? We can picture that in our heads. We can picture our characters doing that. That's why it's really important. Now let's look and see if you can figure out whether a sentence is active or passive. The entrance exam was failed by more than 1/3 of the applicants at the school. Find your verb and then find your doer. Who did that? Now, if you picked passive, you're correct. So was failed is your verb, and your applicants did that, and they're at the end of the sentence. The book is being read by most of the class. Is it active or passive? If you pick passive, you're correct there as well. So is being read is your verb, and most of the class is your doer, your subject, your action, person, or activity. That goes at the end. Sue walked the dog. If you picked active, you're correct. So where's your doer, Sue, and she comes before the verb, walked. John was punched by Sam. So, is it active or passive? Your verb is was punched. Where's your doer? Sam is at the end. He's the one who punched John, who is your passive recipient of the action. Mistakes were made. If you picked passive, you're correct. The problem here, or maybe the difficulty, would be that we don't have a doer here. Now, this is a favorite statement of politicians everywhere, so it's a lot of fun to listen to whether our officials speak in active or passive voice. You can do that experiment this week and see what people say. Sometimes people don't want to admit a mistake, or they're hoping that we won't ask, or they're hoping that maybe that will just sort of be forgotten, right, by the audience. And so you'll hear that statement. So do a little experiment this week and see if your officials speak in active or passive voice. Here's another one. Frank aced his midterm writing extravaganza. Is that active or passive? So aced is your verb and Frank did the action. So it's going to be active voice. So you see, this isn't really very hard. You can do this every time you write. And if you want to write, put your doer first in every sentence. Subject, verb, direct object. You will always write an active voice and you'll be really pleased with your results.